At my grandson's welcome home party, my son-in-law carried the toy chest I'd spent 5 months building out his own front door and set it down on the curb next to the recycling bins. He did it smiling because his buddy was filming. "We're a no-clutter house," he told the phone, and gave the lid a little pat like he was putting down a dog. The folding chairs full of people laughed the way people do when they can't tell yet if something's a joke. I didn't shout. I didn't cry in front of them. I walked out the front door past all of them, picked up my chest off the curb, carried it to my car, and drove home with it riding shotgun. That night my daughter called me, and she was crying so hard I could barely make her out. "Mom," she said, "please, what did you put in the bottom of that chest?" I sat down at my kitchen table. I'll tell you exactly what my son-in-law set out with the trash that afternoon in front of 40 people for the sin of being homemade, and I'll tell you what happened to this family when they all finally found out what was inside it. Welcome back to Brave Mom Stories, where the gift they call clutter is usually the only thing in the room that no amount of money could ever buy back. Stay with me to the end. Leave a comment and don't forget to subscribe. My name's Lorraine. I'm 67. And for 38 years, my husband and I ran a little furniture repair shop on the south end of town, the kind of place where people brought you a dresser that belonged to their grandmother with a leg held on by a coat hanger, and you sent it home looking like it had 100 more years in it. Hank did the joinery. I did the finishing and the carving, and somewhere around year 10 I started building things from scratch. Toy boxes, hope chests, a rocking horse now and then for a customer who'd ask real shy if I'd ever consider it. I know wood the way some people know their own kids. I can put my hand flat on a tabletop and tell you whether it was made by somebody who cared or somebody who was getting paid by the piece. My hands aren't what they used to be. The arthritis got into the knuckles about 6 years back, slow at first, and then all at once, the way it does. There are mornings I have to run them under hot water and flex them open one at a time before I can even hold a chisel. And some days I can't hold one at all. I don't tell you that for sympathy. I tell you so you understand what 5 months of building cost me. And why I did it anyway. People look at a woman like me and they see somebody's grandmother. A nice old gal with a craft. My son-in-law looked at me and saw exactly that, and I let him, because being underestimated is a quiet kind of armor, and I've worn it my whole life. But I spent 38 years watching folks walk into my shop with $800 furniture from the big stores, the kind held together with staples and glue and a prayer. And I watched those same pieces come apart in 3 years, while the ugly old oak sideboard somebody's great-grandfather built was still standing. I know what lasts. I know what doesn't. And the night my daughter called me, with her voice in pieces, I knew my son-in-law had just found out the difference the hard way. Let me start where it really starts, which is with Hank. My husband passed 13 months before that party. 44 years of marriage. Then a bad cough that turned out to be the worst thing it could be. Then 4 months that went too fast, and then a house that got real quiet real sudden. Hank wasn't a flashy man. He drove a 1998 F-150 until the floorboards practically wore through, and he wore the same canvas barn coat every fall until the elbows gave out, and I patched them with leather. He was the kind of man who'd notice the new kid bagging groceries, looked wrung out, and slip him a 5 for a coffee and never say another word about it. But Hank was a saver. Not a hoarder of money, more like a planter of it. He thought in long stretches of time most people never bother to think in. While other men his age bought base boats and snowmobiles, Hank bought boring things and let the years do the heavy lifting. Patience pays better interest than any bank, Lori, he used to say, and I used to roll my eyes at him, and he was right, and I'd give anything to roll my eyes at him one more time. What I didn't understand until near the very end was how long he'd been getting ready for somebody who didn't exist yet. Our daughter married late, and the baby took a while to come. Hank wanted to be a grandfather more than I ever saw him want anything in 44 years. He'd talk about it out on the porch in the evenings, the fishing he'd teach, the terrible jokes he'd tell, all the trouble he and that kid were going to get into together. He'd point his beer bottle up north, toward the lake, and grin. He didn't make it. The baby was still just a hope when Hank got sick, a maybe, a someday. He died not knowing for sure he'd ever have a grandchild at all. Here's the part I think about every single day. About 2 weeks before the end, when we both knew where this was headed and had stopped pretending otherwise, Hank had me bring him the old metal lockbox from the top shelf of the hall closet. I'd seen that box up there for 30 years and never once opened it. I figured it was old tax papers, or his dad's Korea medals, or the kind of nothing a man keeps because pitching it feels like a little death. It wasn't nothing. Inside was the deed to the cabin up on Birch Lake. You have to understand what that cabin was. Hank's family had owned that little patch of shoreline since before he was born. 2 bedrooms, a wood stove, a dock that needed work every spring, an outhouse for the first 20 years we owned it, until Hank finally put in real plumbing himself one summer. It wasn't fancy, but it was 40 feet of lake frontage up in the part of Michigan where lake frontage has gotten so dear that the people who grew up there can't afford to die there anymore. And the deed in that box was free and clear. Hank had spent 11 years quietly paying off the loan his folks left on it, a little extra every month, never once mentioning it to me because he didn't want me to fret about the money. Underneath the deed was a velvet ring bag, the kind you get from a jeweler, heavy in my hand, silver dollars. 44 of them. One for every year we'd been married. He'd been buying one each anniversary and squirreling it away, and I never knew, not once in all that time. And underneath the coins was an envelope. On it, in Hank's blocky pencil, that man printed everything, never could do cursive, it said, for our grandbaby, whenever you get here, to be opened at 18. I figured there'd be a little one someday, Hank told me, and his voice was thin but his eyes were clear. Wanted to hand him something nobody could ever take back, a place to come back to. The cabin's theirs, Lori. Don't let it get sold for a parking lot. Then he told me the part that mattered more than the cabin and the coins put together. He took my hand, and his grip was already getting weak, and he said, "Don't just hand it over in an envelope. They'll lose the envelope. They'll spend the coins and forget where they came from. And the cabin'll get sold the first hard winter somebody wants a new truck. Put it somewhere they'll have to keep. Build it into something. Make 'em find it." That was nearly the last clear thing my husband ever asked of me, and I meant to do it exactly right. So I built a toy chest. I started about a month after the funeral, partly for the baby that we still didn't know was coming for sure, and partly, I'll be honest, to give my hands something to do besides shake at 3 in the morning. Cedar, because it smells like up north and it keeps the moths off. I dovetailed the corners by hand even though my knuckles screamed at me, because Hank taught me dovetails our first year of marriage, and I wanted that man's hands in this thing alongside mine. On the lid, I carved a lake and pines along the far shore, and a little dock running out into it, and a boy and an old man sitting on the end with their lines in the water. In the bottom corner, small enough you'd have to know to look, I carved the initials, EJP, once we finally learned the baby was a boy and what they'd name him. It took 5 months. There were nights I cried over it, and not from my hands, from the missing. But I finished it, and I'll say without any false modesty that it was the best thing I ever built in 38 years of building. Then I did the real work. I built the bottom of that chest with a false floor. It's a trick the old steamer trunks used, a thin panel of cedar that lifts out with a little brass pull recessed in the grain and a shallow compartment beneath. It sits flush. You'd never know. And I made it that way on purpose, so that the chest could still be used every single day of that boy's childhood, hauled full of blocks and trucks and dinosaurs, and the whole time, an inch beneath all that noise, his grandfather's plan would be waiting. Into that compartment I laid the deed to the cabin, the velvet bag of silver dollars, and Hank's letter, sealed, to be opened at 18. A whole lake. 44 years of a marriage, and a dead man's last words to a boy he'd never get to meet, tucked into something a young man would call clutter. I want to tell you about my son-in-law, because I don't want him to come off as some cartoon villain. He's more than that, and the more is the sad part. His name's Trevor. He grew up the only child of a woman named Sandra, who I have met maybe 4 times, and who has all 4 times, found a way to mention the square footage of her house inside the first 10 minutes. Trevor was raised to believe that what a thing is worth is printed right there on the box, and that the worst thing that can happen to a person is to be seen as someone who can't afford the good version. He's done well for himself. He's got some kind of online business, sells a course on something. I never could follow it, and he's good-looking and quick, and he's got that way about him, where the whole room sort of leans toward whoever he's deciding to like that day. He curates everything. His house is gray and white and looks like a furniture showroom that nobody's allowed to actually live in. He's got opinions about minimalism. He posts about his systems. And once my daughter got pregnant, that baby started turning into the centerpiece of all of it. A nursery somebody photographed for a website, a registry full of brands I'd never heard of, a whole performance of a perfect modern little life, filmed and posted and admired. I tried to like him. I did. He was never exactly mean to me. He just looked at me and my truck and my hands the way you'd look at something you found at a yard sale. Polite, a little puzzled, like he wasn't sure why I'd been let in. I think underneath all of it, Trevor's scared. Scared the way his mother taught him to be. Scared that if the wrong person looks too close, they'll find out he came from somewhere ordinary, and that ordinary is the worst thing a person can be. And the cruel little joke of people built like that is they cannot recognize the genuinely precious when it's sitting right in front of them, because it didn't come with a logo. He was about to prove that in front of 40 people with a camera running, and he had no earthly idea what he was holding when he did it. And I have to tell you about my daughter, because the part of this that still aches isn't Trevor. It's her. Whitney is a good girl who has spent her whole life trying to keep everybody happy, which is a thing she got from her father, except Hank knew when to plant his feet, and Whitney never quite learned it. She's warm. She's funny when she forgets to worry. She loved her dad to pieces. And she fell hard for Trevor, and somewhere in the falling she got quiet, agreeable, smoothing things over, going along to get along. When Sandra started redecorating my daughter's whole life in shades of gray, Whitney just let her. It was easier. Whitney has always reached for easier. After Hank died, she came apart the way the quiet ones do. Privately, where it wouldn't inconvenience anybody. She'd call me late sometimes, just to talk about her dad. She kept his old fishing hat on a hook by her back door. She, of anyone, knew exactly who her father was. Which is why, when the truth finally came out, it didn't break Trevor. Trevor deflected. It broke her, because she was standing right there in that yard. She watched her husband call her dead father's gift clutter and set it on the curb, and my daughter, keeping the peace, reaching for easier, said nothing. Remember that when we get to the phone call. The voice falling apart on the line that night was a daughter who'd just found out what her own silence had cost. The party was Trevor's idea, of course. They called it a sip and see. That's the new thing. You have a party so everybody can come meet the baby and have a mimosa and take pictures. The invitation came as a text with a little graphic on it, a dress code, a color palette. I didn't mind. I was, God help me, excited. I had the most important thing in the world, sitting in the bed of my truck under a moving blanket, and I'd practiced in my head 100 times how it would go. Trevor or Whitney would open the chest, and inside they'd find soft baby quilts I'd tucked in to fill it. And then I'd say, gentle, there's a panel in the bottom, sweetheart. Lift the little brass pull. There's something your dad left for him. And they'd find the deed and the coins and the letter, and the whole yard would go quiet, and everybody would understand that the man who couldn't be there had been getting ready for this baby for 30 years. Make 'em find it, Hank said. I was going to make sure they found it. I drove over with that chest riding in the passenger seat, belted in like a person, because it was too precious to bounce around in the bed. I talked to Hank a little on the way I still do. Big day, I told him. We're giving them the lake. I had no idea I was about to watch a young man set my husband out with the garbage. Their place was done up like a magazine spread. White balloons in 3 careful shades, a table of tiny, expensive things that cost more than they fed, a banner with the baby's name in gold. There were young women in outfits that knew they were being photographed, and young men in those sneakers that cost $300 and looked like they came free with something. I felt like a sparrow that had flown in an open window. But I wasn't unhappy because I had my secret, and a secret keeps you warm. Every time one of those glossy young people glanced at my plain old cedar chest and got that little flicker of pity on their face, I just thought about the panel in the bottom, and I smiled to myself. I want you to sit with that because of everything that happened. It's the part I grieve the most. I walked in happy. I walked in carrying my dead husband's whole love for a boy he'd never hold, ready to hand it over with both arms, glad to do it. I had no armor on at all. Why would I? You don't bring armor to a party for a baby. You bring a gift and an open heart, and you figure the people there will at least be kind. The one bright spot was Faye. Hank's older sister, 70 now, sharp as a tack and twice as warm, the only other person in that yard who'd loved my husband. She found me in the kitchen and squeezed my arm. "There it is," she said, looking at the chest. "Hank told me what you were tucking in the bottom of that thing, the old softy. That boy's a lucky little fish." She winked. "You ought to tell Trevor before he opens it, so he's careful with it." "Hank's orders," I said. "They find it themselves. I'll point them to the panel after." Faye laughed. "He always did love a bit of theater, my brother." I think about that little exchange more than almost anything. If I'd listened to her, if I'd stood up and announced before Trevor laid a hand on it that there was a paid-off lake cabin and his son's whole future sealed in the bottom, none of what came next would have happened. He'd have handled it like the Hope Diamond. There'd have been no story. But I didn't, partly because I was honoring a dying man's wish, and partly because in 67 years of living, it had honestly never once crossed my mind that a grown man would take a handmade thing, probably somebody that grandpa never built him, and set it out with the trash. Refold it badly, sure. Stick it in a closet, regift it someday, even quietly hate it. But carry it out to the curb in front of everybody with a phone filming? That was a failure of imagination on my part. I'd never met cruelty quite that easy and quite that casual. The gifts went the way you'd expect. Trevor ran it like one of his product launches. Whitney sat with the baby. And oh, that baby, my Eli, 8 pounds of him with Hank's exact stubborn chin. And Trevor held each gift up for the camera, said the brand name out loud, and tagged the giver in the air. A baby monitor that talks to your phone. A stroller with a name like a sports car. A high chair that cost what we used to make in a month. Each one held up, admired, filmed. And then there were 2 things left. A gift card in an envelope, and my cedar chest. Trevor picked it up. I watched him register the weight of it, the heft of real wood, and for just a second I let myself hope, because I saw something move across his face that might have been respect. Then I saw him decide what it was. His buddy Cody swung the phone around. Trevor ran his hand over the carved lid, the lake, the pines, the old man, and the boy on the dock, and I waited for him to see it, to really see it. "Ah," he said. "Did you make this?" "I did, honey," I said, and my voice came out warm, and I started to lean forward to tell him about the panel, about Hank, about lifting the little brass pull. "There's something special about it. You'll want to." But he was already talking over me, to the yard, to the camera. "That's so sweet," he said, in the voice you use to end a conversation. "It's very handmade." And Sandra laughed her little laugh from the patio and said, "Bless her heart, look at that." I felt the yard tilt, that old familiar feeling of being made small. But I still didn't understand what was about to happen. I thought the worst of it was the word handmade and the bless her heart. I figured I'd just smile through it and point them to the panel later in private, and the cabin would redeem the whole afternoon. I was wrong about how far he'd take it. What happened next happened fast, and I have run it back in slow motion about 10,000 times since. Trevor stood there with my chest in his arms, and he looked around at his gray and white yard and his careful balloons and his filming friend and his watching guests, and I watched him do the math. The social math of a man who lives for an audience. A handmade cedar toy box didn't fit the picture. It clashed with the brand, and he had a camera running and a crowd to perform for. And somewhere in his label-measured heart, he decided the funny, on-brand, content-worthy thing to do was to make a little bit of a joke out of his wife's mother. He walked it right through the house, out the front door, and down the walk to the curb, narrating the whole way for Cody's phone. "Okay, so Grandma came through with a big old wood box," he said, laughing. "I love her. But you guys know us. We're a no-clutter house. We don't do this." And he set my chest down on the concrete next to the recycling bin, where the truck would come Tuesday, and he gave the lid that little pat. "Sorry, Grandma. We only do clean lines around here." My chest. The carved lake. Hank's dovetails. The deed to 40 feet of shoreline that man paid off $100 at a time. The 44 silver dollars. The last letter my husband ever wrote, sealed up, waiting 18 years for a boy to read it. Sitting on the curb with the recycling. Some of them laughed. Not all of them. Just enough. That nervous follow. The leader laugh of people who've decided the man with the most followers in the yard is the funny one, so the safe thing is to laugh along. Sandra clapped, delighted. And my daughter, my Whitney, stood on the porch with the baby in her arms, went white as a sheet, opened her mouth and closed it again. That was the worst second of the whole day. Not my chest on the curb, my daughter's mouth closing. I've heard plenty of unkind things in 67 years. I've been called old-fashioned, behind the times, a sweet little nobody with her tools. None of it ever landed like watching that boy set my husband's whole heart out for the garbage truck while my own child stood there and said nothing. Now here is where it turns, and here is the part I most want you to understand, because it's the hinge of everything. I had a choice in that moment. I could have marched down that walk and let him have it. I could have said, "You foolish, shallow boy, do you have any idea what you just set out with the trash? There is a paid-off lake cabin in the bottom of that chest. There is the last letter your son's grandfather will ever write him. There is 44 years of a marriage you'll never understand." I could have made a scene that Yard would talk about for a decade. And believe me, part of me, the widow, the mother bear, the woman whose ruined hands had bled into those dovetails, part of me wanted to so bad I could taste it, but I didn't, because in that exact second, 3 things were true all at once. 1, the cabin and the coins and the letter were safe, sealed behind a panel he didn't know was there and would never have found. 2, a camera was running, and the cruelty was being recorded by the cruel man's own friend, which meant the truth would keep just fine without my help. And 3, this is the one that decided it. I looked at that performing, frightened young man, and I understood that the worst possible punishment I could hand him was not a scene. It was the truth, delivered later, when he could no longer pretend he hadn't done it. So I did the only thing in that yard with any dignity left in it. I walked down the front walk, past all of them, in no hurry at all. I bent down and I picked up my chest off the curb. And I carried it to my truck, and I belted it back into the passenger seat where it had ridden over, and I drove home, and I did not say one single word. If you've ever stood in a room full of people and watched something you made with your own 2 hands get treated like garbage. If you've ever had your time and your love tossed aside because it didn't come with the right name on it, then you know the particular quiet that comes after. Stay with me. This is where it all comes back around. I got home and I set the chest on my kitchen table and I sat with it, and I'll tell you, I did cry then, alone, where it belonged. Then, around 9 o'clock, the phone rang, and it was Whitney, and she was crying so hard, I had to ask her 3 times to slow down. What I didn't know was what had happened after I left. Faye had stayed. And Faye, God love her, had assumed, the way I'd assumed, that everybody in that family knew the cabin was in the bottom of that chest, because Hank had told her months ago like it was settled. So when Faye watched her brother's gift get set on the curb and watched me drive off without a word, she got up out of her folding chair, walked over to my daughter, and said, quiet but not quiet enough, "Whitney, honey, do you have any idea what your husband just put out with the recycling?" And Whitney said no, and Faye told her, "Mom," my daughter could barely get it out, "Mom, please, what did you put in the bottom of that chest?" Aunt Faye said, she said, "Dad, Mom, what's in it?" I held the chest in my lap. I felt along the bottom for the little brass pull I'd recessed into the grain. "Why do you ask, sweetheart?" I said, gentle as I could. Because I just watched my husband throw it on the curb, she said, and I didn't stop him, and now Aunt Faye is telling me that Dad left something. Mom, I need you to tell me what I let happen. So I told her. I lifted the panel, right there on the phone, and I told her what was under it. The deed to Birch Lake, free and clear, the cabin her father spent 11 years quietly paying off so there'd be a place for a boy who didn't exist yet to learn to fish. The 44 silver dollars, one for every year of us. And the letter. To be opened at 18. Love, Grandpa. There was a long silence on the line, then a sound I'd never heard my grown daughter make, and I'm her mother. I've heard her cry her whole life. This was different. This was a person realizing all at once exactly who she'd married and exactly what she'd stood by and let him do. I want to be careful here, I told her, because I am her mother and I will be till the day I die. Whitney, I need you to hear me say this. I am not crying tonight over a cabin. I had the cabin. I gave the cabin away gladly. I am crying because I built that chest with hands that don't close right anymore. 5 months of mornings I had to run under hot water just to hold the chisel. And your husband called it clutter and didn't even look at it. And you watched him set it down with the trash and you said nothing. The money isn't the wound, baby. You are. That's the part you've got to look at. I heard her take that the way you take a punch you know you've got coming. The dinner happened the following Sunday at my kitchen table because I would not set foot in that gray house and I told them so. Whitney came, and she brought Trevor, and she brought the baby, and to my surprise she'd told Sandra to stay home, which was the first hard line I'd ever watched my daughter draw with anybody. I put the chest in the middle of the table. I lifted the panel. I laid the deed and the velvet bag and the sealed letter out on the wood in front of all of them, and I watched Trevor's face do the thing I'd waited a whole week to see. He went gray. He picked up the deed with 2 fingers like might bite him. This is Birch Lake, he said. The lake place? This is paid off? It's your son's, I said. It was your son's the day I sealed it in. It is not, and will never be, yours, and I want you to understand why. I'd had the week to think, and I'd been to see a lawyer, and I'd done it right. The cabin doesn't go in their names. It goes into a trust, with Faye and me as trustees, held for Eli until he's 25, and it cannot be sold or borrowed against by anybody, including his parents, including me. Hank wanted that boy to have a place nobody could ever take back. That now includes the people who'd take it back fastest. The coins go in the trust, I said. The letter. Your son reads at 18, from my hand, not yours, because you have shown me exactly how much of his grandfather's love you can be trusted to carry, and the answer is none. I let that sit. And that video your friend posted? The one where you set my husband out with the garbage and called it clutter for a laugh? You took it down Sunday night, I noticed. But your buddy's friends had already shared it, and Whitney tells me a fair number of them have seen what was in the bottom of the box you trashed for content. I didn't do that to you, Trevor. You filmed it. There's a lesson in that, too, about living your whole life for a camera. He didn't have anything. For the first time since I'd known him, that quick-talking young man had not one word. But it was Whitney I was watching. My daughter reached across the table and put her hand flat on the carved lid of the chest, on the little old man and the little boy out at the end of the dock, and she traced it, and she said, I've been replaying it all week, and I keep landing on the same thing. I didn't fail Dad when I let Trevor carry it to the curb. I failed him 100 times before that. Every single time I stayed quiet to keep the peace. The chest was just the one I couldn't unsee. You knew that about me for years, I said. Why didn't you ever say it? Because some things a person has to come to on her own, I told her. I could have said it 1,000 times, baby. It took a wooden box on a curb to make you believe it. Here's how it shook out, in the months after, because I know you want the ledger and not just the feeling. The trust is locked and it's growing. The cabin appraised at $130-some thousand, which is more than the down payment on Trevor's gray house, a fact I have not pointed out to him because I don't have to. Eli can't touch it till he's grown, and neither can anybody else, ever. Hank thought, in decades. So now does his grandson's future. Trevor and I will never be close, and I've made my peace with that. But the boy got humbled in a way. His mother's money never did the work of humbling him, and humble suits him better than he'd ever have guessed. He has never quite apologized. He's not built for it. But a few weeks back, he showed up at my shop alone, and he stood in the doorway a long minute, and then he asked if I'd ever consider teaching him to use a chisel. I said yes. We have made one truly ugly little stool together. He kept it. He didn't set it on the curb. It's a start. Whitney is the one who changed the most. Grief and shame did to her what 40 years of going along never could. They grew her a backbone. She's drawn lines with Sandra. She took Hank's fishing hat off the hook by the back door and hung it in the nursery instead, over the cedar chest, which now sits in my grandson's room, full of blocks and stuffed dogs, exactly the way I built it to be used. She told me last week she's teaching Eli to say Grandpa off a photo of Hank, even though the boy's barely a year, because she doesn't want there to be a single day he didn't know the man's name. My hands are worse this winter. Some mornings the chisel wins and I can't carve at all. But I'm making that boy a step stool, slow, a few minutes on the good days, with his grandpa's initials cut small into the underside of the top, where nobody'll see them, and he'll find them someday if he knows to look. Because that's what we do, the homemade grandmothers. We carve ourselves into things quietly and we wait. If there's one thing I'd hand you out of all of this, it's this. The world is going to tell you, louder every single year, that what a thing is worth is printed right there on the label. That the expensive gift is the real one and the handmade one is sweet but lesser. Don't you believe it? The most valuable thing in any room is almost always the quiet one, somebody made with their hands and gave without a logo, and it is the easiest thing in the world to throw on the curb if nobody ever taught you how to look. So learn how to look. And whatever it is you love, build it into something that lasts, and never once let anybody tell you it belongs with the trash. That's my story. One cedar chest, one curb, and a love worth more than that whole gray house full of clean lines. If it reminded you of something handmade you still hold on to, go tell the person who made it tonight, while you still can. Leave me a comment, hit subscribe, and I'll see you next time.